What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance crew, and you're watching DaVinci Reacts. Today I'm going to be getting into a video that, for me, was so fascinating that I kind of went against one of my normal rules when it comes to reactions. I try not to react to recent videos from YouTube content creators, so I'm not talking about people that re-upload stuff. Like, my comedy reactions are videos that are re-uploaded by somebody that has nothing to do with the comedian. And most of the time those get copyright claims, so they make money off of it anyway. So it pretty much is doing them a favor in a way. But when it comes to straight up YouTube content creators, a lot of them don't really have their stuff copywritten. So I try to wait and give their video time to, get views and things like that before I ever decide, okay, I'm gonna react to it. That's one of the reasons why, I'm going and doing that's one of the reasons why I tend to go back and do the first video of something somebody makes, like my try not to laughs and things like that. But this video was uploaded by the Infographics show, and it was something that was so fascinating that I felt like, oh, this is something that I have to react to, because this will have a great conversation in it. So this video is called Worst Things Worst Things People Have Done to Each Other Throughout History. So it's a video that pretty much talks about human atrocities. And, well, you guys can see. It's kind of like a countdown list. I've already seen it, for those that want to wonder. I have seen it. But like I said, this is a video that is going to have a great conversation to it. So stick around, and we'll go ahead and do that after or during, maybe. I don't know. Sometimes I choose when I want to talk about it.
You might be a little confused reading the title of the show, so we'll begin by telling you we're talking about human deprivation at a mass scale. What events in human history have led to the most deaths? We're using a list that was created by author Matthew White, who describes himself as an atrocitologist. He writes about what he calls hemoclisms, or blood floods. White studied as many documents as he could and put together a list of when the most blood flowed and what was to blame. Welcome to this episode of the Infographics Show, the 21 worst things people have done to each other. If many millions died due to some conflict in the 8th century, when the world population was around 220 million, according to Worldometers, that could be considered worse than many millions, perhaps even many more millions dying when the world had a population of, say, 2 billion. We'll give you the biggest death tolls in history, but also tell you what were perhaps the biggest blood floods in terms of the population when the deaths happened. We should add the disclaimer that these figures are in no way totally accurate. Even when we speak about tragedies of the 20th century, they are estimates, and the further we go back, the more guesswork is employed. Getting our hands on accurate historical data from hundreds of years ago is not possible, so scientists just do their best. In terms of conflicts, we're talking about soldiers and civilians, as well as corollary casualties, such as those that died from famine during conflicts. As Pinker points out, this is also tricky because we must ask how many people would have died from famine during those years if a conflict had not occurred. Anyway, here's our list from worst to absolute worst. 21. French Wars of Religion, 16th century, 3 million deaths. These wars spanned from 1562 to 1598 and were over the matter of religion, in this case Catholicism and Reformed Calvinist Protestants. We use the plural because there were 8 wars in total. As you likely know, there was a Protestant Reformation going on in Europe, and this shift in religious ideas was hard to stomach for Catholics. This might seem a paltry matter today, but it certainly wasn't then. After all the deaths from massacres, fighting, famine, and disease, it was agreed upon to promote civil tolerance and religious coexistence. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 14 million deaths, 17th place. 20. Chinese Civil War, 20th century, 3 million deaths. This lasted from 1927 to 1936 and was fought between the Communist Party of China and the Republic of China. Many battles would be fought with a...
Okay, I'm gonna get back into it. This is something that actually confused me, because I remember that China fell to communism after World War II. But this says the Civil War was between the 20s and the 30s. I'm not sure how exactly communists took over China after. Did they get voted in? I mean, I guess that's possible. They could have came in peacefully. But then again, that doesn't sound like how communism normally comes in and takes over. But yeah, anybody that knows the full story to this, go ahead and leave it in the comment section down below, because like I said, I could have sworn China went communist after World War II.
Another civil war following. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 3 million deaths, 21st place. 19. Napoleonic Wars, 19th century, 3 million deaths. For 12 years in the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte led his troops to battle all over Europe. Many countries formed a coalition to fight against the little man and his armies, but the biggest foe was Great Britain. The wars ended when Napoleon was defeated on the 18th of June 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. That's in present-day Belgium. 2 days prior, Napoleon's army had defeated the Prussian army, but they had joined with a much larger British army led by the Duke of Wellington. That ended badly for Napoleon. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 11 million deaths, 19th place. 18. Russia's time of troubles, 16th to 17th century, 5 million deaths. It sounds kind of vague, time of troubles, but that's what it was, many troubles. During this period, Russia fought with the Polish, was occupied, saw multiple civil uprisings, and experienced a terrible famine that wiped out much of the population. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 23 million deaths, 14th place. 17. 30 Years' War, 17th century, 7 million deaths. The worst of the religious wars. This was fought mainly in Central Europe, and again it was related to the Protestant Reformation. The battles were fought from 1618 to 1648, but again many of the deaths were related to famine, not just fighting. Towns and villages were destroyed, and the people all around Europe lost all they had. Armies marauded, and disease and famine finished those left behind. Interrogations and witch hunts took many more lives. This was a time of brutality and paranoia all over Europe. People starved to death in the worst areas, and there were even reports of people resorting to cannibalism. A low point for Europe and for religion, too. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 32 million deaths, 13th place. 16. Congo Free State, 19th to 20th century, 8 million deaths. Led by the ruthless King Leopold II of Belgium, this part of Africa was plundered of its natural resources while the local people were carved up and brutalized in ways that turn one's stomach. This really was the heart of darkness, and it's said that the Belgians decimated the population, with about 50% killed or dying because of the way they were worked. The horror, and we repeat the horror, lasted from 1885 to 1908. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 12 million deaths, 18th place. 15. Fall of Rome, 3rd to 5th century, 8 million deaths. I bet you weren't expecting this to be on the list. The fall of Rome was a long, drawn-out affair, and it was a bloody spectacle too. Civil wars, barbarian invasions, political crises, corruption, religious discord, and God knows how many battles, and well, that led to a lot of blood flowing. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 105 million deaths, 5th place.
Crazy.
14.
That's like a
Russian
plague.
Civil War, 20th century, 9 million deaths. This lasted from 1918 to 1921, and it was fought between what were called the Whites and the Reds, or you might just call them the Bolsheviks and the Monarchists, capitalists and militarists, or anyone against Lenin's ideology. The Socialists won, and the Soviet Union soon was born. Some put the death toll much higher than 9 million because so many civilians died. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 9 million deaths, 20th place. 13. First World War, 20th century, 15 million deaths. We probably don't need to tell you much about this war. Tension was rife in Europe. Germany wanted an empire. And then a young man called Gavrilo Princip went and killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. That almost didn't happen. 32 countries ended up fighting, and more civilians died than soldiers. The war started in 1914 and ended in 1918.
The next time I do reactions, I'm going to be reacting to Oversimplified's World War I video.
20th century adjusted death toll, 15 million deaths, 16th place. 12. British India, mostly preventable famine. 19th century, 17 million deaths. You can read many books about the impact the British had on India, with most historians taking a very dim view of what happened during the days of empire. Perhaps some writers, such as Neil Ferguson, believed the British did as much good as bad. No one doubts that the British Empire was mostly responsible for some famines, knowing landlords were stockpiling food and charging high prices during times of crisis. British administrative policies were bad, taxes were raised, and while the Brits were exporting crops and making a ton of money, Indian peasants had nothing to eat. It's a long, complicated story and we can't cover it all here. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 35 million deaths. 12th place. 11. Timur-Lenk, Tamerlane. 14th to 15th century, 17 million deaths. This Turco-Mongol conqueror traveled around parts of Asia, Africa, and Europe, and his armies were feared like no other. He came, he saw, he conquered, and he left a trail of blood behind him, becoming a very powerful Muslim leader. He was born in present-day Uzbekistan. History tells us he had aspirations of another great Mongol empire. This great military leader, it seems, died from something like a cold while he was on his way to cause mayhem in China. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 100 million deaths. 6th place. 10. Atlantic slave trade. 15th to 19th century, 18 million deaths. Another blight on humanity was the human trafficking of African people to be used and abused as slaves. There were many guilty parties from all parts of the world, but at this time it was mainly the European colonists that were the big slave trading nations. The slaves were worked, sometimes to death, in cotton plantations, mines, sugar plantations, or as construction workers and more. Moreover, Muslim countries had been trading in African slaves before the Europeans. In the USA, the use of slaves split much of the country, and that was the main reason behind the American Civil War. The rich farmers in the South didn't want the North's anti-slavery sentiments forced on them for fear of losing their free labor pool. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 83 million deaths. 8th place. 9. Mid-East slave trade. 7th to 19th century, 19 million deaths. As we said, the slave trade had been going on in the Middle East long before the Europeans had blood on their rapacious hands. We should add that some Africans were absolutely involved in this trade too, as sellers. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 132 million deaths. 3rd place. 8. Joseph Stalin, 20th century, 20 million deaths. We don't need to tell you much about the paranoid so-called Man of Steel. His great purge sent so many to the gulags, his policies led to mass starvation, and no one felt safe, not even those close to him. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 20 million deaths. 15th place. 7. Annihilation of the American Indians. 15th to 19th century, 20 million deaths. Almost overlooked by some Americans is how much blood was shed when settlers went over to the New World and exterminated anyone that stood in their way. The new Americans kept this going for centuries. They destroyed people and slowly denuded a culture that had been there before them for a long time. While memes today surface on the internet concerning the original immigrants in America, present Americans, the mass slaughter of indigenous people still remains somewhat a cloaked tragedy. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 92 million deaths. 7th place. 6. Taiping Rebellion, 19th century, 20 million deaths. This took place from 1850 to 1864 when there was a revolt in China against the Qing dynasty. Hung Xiuquan, the leader of the rebellion, had ideas for a new dynasty called the Taiping, the New Peace. Influenced by Protestantism, he had many people behind him. The poor were sick and tired of the abuses they suffered at the hands of the ruling Chinese, and they fought for change. The Brits ended up helping the Qing dynasty when it looked like the Taipings were doing well. This wasn't out of concern for any Chinese people, but because the British feared their trade would suffer. The rebellion crashed and burned in the end. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 40 million deaths. 10th place. 5. Fall of the Ming dynasty. 17th century, 25 million deaths. Still with China. For decades, the Qing dynasty fought with the southern Ming dynasty. The Ming were also fighting their own peasants, many of whom had revolted. It took a long time, but the Qings were victorious. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 112 million deaths. 4th place. 4. An Lushan Revolt. 8th century, 36 million deaths. You're probably wondering what this was, and you won't be alone. It was another rebellion in China. It started in 755 and ended in 763. In short, the ruling Tang dynasty came up against General An Lushan and his army, who wanted to form a new Great Yan dynasty with him as emperor. He was successful only for his own dynasty to later crumble. He was even killed by his own son. Considering in that century there were about 220 million people in the world, well, imagine a war, now killing around 1/6 of the world's population. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll,
Damn.
429 million deaths. First place. 3. Mongol conquests. 13th century, 40 million deaths. You've all heard about the Mongol conquests, first led by the great and brutal military leader Genghis Khan, so we won't go into details. The Mongol armies defeated armies all over Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 278 million deaths. Second place. 2. Mao Zedong. Mostly government-caused famine. 20th century, 40 million deaths. No fan of petty bourgeoisie individualism, Mao Zedong set out to collectivize his people, and that was tragic in many ways. His brutal campaign led to the deaths of millions, and his great leap forward was a terrible fall backwards for much of the country. His policies led to starvation from famine. His punishments were harsh. People were sent to camps to slowly die, and some deliberately starved to death. Historians tell us the atrocities at the very worst included parents being forced to bury their own children alive if they had transgressed. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 40 million deaths. 11th place. 1. Second World War, 20th century, 55 million deaths. Again, we don't need to explain to you what happened here. This war spanned the globe from 1939 to 1945. The numbers vary drastically as to how many died in total, with civilian casualties hard to know. War-related disease and famine took many millions of lives, as did the battlefield. Mid-20th century adjusted death toll, 55 million deaths. 9th place. Oscar Wilde once said, "As long as war is regarded as wicked, it will always have its fascination. When it's looked upon as vulgar, it will cease to be popular." We are now perhaps at a stage where we see such brutality as vulgar, even though we still sometimes prefer heroism over actual honestly depicted brutality. We can tend to gloss over the historical tragedies, which might be a grave mistake. We have, however, experienced a long peace in terms of big wars, and some believe or hope we might be past mass murder, such as we have discussed in this show. We might also have evolved out of treating other human beings like products and doing away with them as we choose. But that's a question for you. Do you think we won't see such atrocities again? Tell us in the comments. Also, be sure to check out...
Okay. First of all, let me address the whole, are we past a period where we're going to see a major war again? Obviously, we're not. There's going to be a major war at some point. I think the only reason why we haven't seen one recently is because now we have nukes. That's it. The fact that we know we have this weapon that can possibly destroy the world, it's preventing people from doing stuff that they would normally have done had this not existed. I guarantee you that if nuclear weapons weren't discovered at the end of World War II, there would have already been a World War III. I think that World War III would have been the Cold War. I'm pretty sure that would have been the thing. But yeah, it's just because of the mutual assured destruction idea or I don't know if it's a pact. I think it's just an idea. I think that because of that, it keeps people from possibly doing anything too crazy because they know that if they do it, if they do something real crazy, it's going to be fucked up. I think that if there was a way to be sure that the other side wouldn't use a nuke, that countries would be more likely to go to war. So I think that's the reason why. And plus, I don't think that countries that do have nukes are going to attack countries without nukes simply because at that point it makes it look like you're picking on another country. So it makes you look bad as far as the world stage. And that could have negative effects, whether it's economically or whether it's diplomatically or whatever with countries around the world. So you're more likely not going to see that. As far as the atrocities themselves, one of the reasons why I wanted to tackle this video was because I did a video. It was a comedy segment. I forgot which one it was exactly, but there was a part of it that was addressing the Holocaust. I think it was Jimmy Carr's worst insult video I did. And in it, he said the Holocaust was the most disgusting, atrocious thing that humans have ever done. And a lot of people kind of gave that discussion shit because they tend to bring up things as far regarding the communist regimes like Stalin and Mao Zedong and things like that. And while it's true, while I do believe that there are worse things that have happened throughout history than the Holocaust, I don't necessarily put Mao and Stalin above the Holocaust, mainly for this fact. Mao Zedong and Stalin, most of their deaths occurred over a long period of time, whether it was 20 or 30 years or however long their reign existed. Especially Mao Zedong, it happened over a very long period of time. And also with Mao Zedong, most of his deaths came from famine. Now, you could say whether or not the government caused that famine, that's an argument you can make, but really it wasn't necessarily directly instructing executions, even though they did do that. Stalin was probably more execution than Mao was, but still, again, a lot of his deaths came from famines and not managing the resources of his country well. They tend to focus more on military than they do the health and benefit of their people. And like I said, it happened over a long period of time, 20 or 30 years. The Holocaust happened over 3 years. Sometimes I've heard people estimate 4, but between 3 and 4 years to kill 6 million people, most of them Jewish. A lot of other minorities also were killed during that fucking genocide. That's exactly what it was. That's what makes that worse in my book. Now, like I said, you have Mao Zedong and Stalin who killed 20 to 60 million people over a 20, 30-year period. But had Hitler had more time to reign and rule, then his numbers would have been way higher than 20 or 60 million. I mean, like I said, he killed 6 million people in 3 years. That means that within 30 years, he would have killed around the same amount that Mao did, but through direct execution, not famines and things that weren't necessarily like directly instructed by him. It would have been, no, kill him, kill them, kill this group. Like that's where all of his deaths would have come from. Not to mention the people that could have died around it. Now, will he have had a lot of famines and stuff? I don't know, because from what I've heard, as far as Hitler with the actual country of Germany, a lot of people say he did a good job as far as managing the German people. It's just that when it came to minorities and things like that, there was no leniency or anything like that. He didn't give a damn when it came to just straight up murdering other people. So in a way, that's why I say that is worse than those specific examples. But that doesn't mean that other examples throughout history are less impactful than the Holocaust. Like I said, I would put the murder of the Native Americans above the Holocaust. I would put the slave trades above the Holocaust, whether it was the Middle Eastern one or the African or the transatlantic one. I would put the campaigns of Genghis Khan above the Holocaust. Like I said, it's not me saying the Holocaust wasn't bad. I'm just saying, as far as the list of atrocities, the Holocaust would probably be in the top, well, I guess bottom 5. Would probably be in the bottom 5, but there are a few things I'll probably put beneath that. Yeah, the Free State of Congo, that was something that I really looked deep into. Especially in America, you don't hear hardly anything about that. I know that I've read a couple of sources. Some people, or some of the sources I've read said that the people in Belgium were taught growing up how great of a leader Leopold II was, and then it wasn't until much recent times that the atrocities finally started to come to light. But then I've heard some people, like in comment sections and stuff, say that no, we learned about that and we know how bad of a person he was. So I'm getting mixed messages. So if there's anybody from Belgium that, or at least someone that really knows the culture of Belgium, like maybe you visit the country and things like that, maybe you have a better idea of what the sentiment for King Leopold is. Me personally, I have heard that they have King Leopold statues and things like that. So I guess it depends on where the statues are. Like if they're celebrating King Leopold, then I would wonder what type of, how they see him as a historical figure. But like I said, depends on where they're up. Like if it's just a statue in a museum, then that's no problem. I mean, he was a part of history, so yeah, he should, I guess, have a statue in the museum. If it's about artwork, then again, yeah, he was a leader at one point. I'm sure he has paintings, and those paintings do gain value whether or not you agree with what's in them or not. So yeah, that's another thing that I can understand. But yeah, hopefully there's no like statues in like parks and a park named after him or something like that. But I don't know, and I'm not going to really judge people because it's not my place to judge. It's just that I think that he should be viewed more negatively based on what happened. Because I've read that like it was all about trying to manufacture rubber and things like that, and they would come up with all these different things as far as like the ways he enforced the rules for that state that he made. People would have to let me check my time. I'm getting close. People would have to, like, for every person's hand that you would chop off and bring to them, they would give you like bullets in return or something like that, or food or money or something like that in return for them, for like people that they suspected stealing. Like if there's someone suspected of stealing, you like chop off their hand and you would bring the hand to the leader or the king or whatever, and they would give you more like ammunition, or they would give you more food or things like that. Well, obviously people cared more about their own well-being and resources than they did their fellow man, so they would just go around chopping people's hands off whether you stole or not, and presenting it to try to get more stuff, whether it was anything I listed. But there was a ton of atrocities throughout history, and it's crazy how so many of them don't get mentioned. And I'm sure even in this video, there was like a lot of different atrocities out there that don't get enough attention. And I think that, that's something that we as human beings should look back at and try to fix, or at least remember. So if you guys know any type of atrocities that either weren't in this list or doesn't get a lot of attention, I know the rape of Nanking wasn't on here, but that's a popular one. Everybody knows about that one. But I mean, like, as far as like obscure atrocities, Armenian genocide should have been on here also, now that I think about it. But anyway, that's it. I gotta go. This video is about to end itself. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm the original Renaissance man, Devon DaVinci, and you've just been a little bit more enlightened. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and all that good stuff. I'm gonna give you the deuces. Hopefully I'll see you on the next video. Deuces.